Thank you all for coming, despite the weather. It always impresses me when people show up and makes me think that people are interested in finding out more about things like faith and life and church and Jesus and all the good things. So, the topic I picked out for this one is the question of religious faith, but in the context also of doubt, difficulties, questions, inquiries, wonderments. Why doesn't God fill in the blanks and all? I want to say some things about that because I come across loads of people who come with these kinds of questions and wonderments and difficulties and doubts. Just by way of introduction, I want to say something about faith, and for some reason I divided this into 4 parts. So if you're attentive to part 1 and all of a sudden you're into part 3, that means you slept through part 2, and there will be a retake on the test for this. I only divided into sections so I know where I am. If you ask for something like, what's the definition of religious faith? You can come up with many of them. One that I like is, religious faith is what I set my heart upon. And we set our heart upon, in our Christian religion, upon the God in Jesus Christ, who gives us grace and possibilities of life within the context of our church. I think religious faith is a way of living in hope and in love. The word for faith is almost the same as the word trust. You go back to the Greek and you find out that they're similar in their meaning. And tonight I'm going to try to put some emphasis on the fact that when we deal with something like religious faith, we're not just talking about a proof or a knockdown argument that says, this is why I believe, but to invite you also into the very personal and subjective ways that we come at what our religious faith is. You've heard the expression at times probably, seeing is believing, when you get down, hard facts and scientific stuff and evidence. I'm making a case tonight somewhat that believing is seeing. And in our faith context, it gives us a way of seeing life and the world, even in the context of its difficulties, as a way of coming at that life. Gilbert Keith Chesterton, the author, one time said, "Christianity offers an intelligible view of the world. It illuminates what we see in the world." So it's not just rules and regulations or belief systems. It's a way of living. So, to start the first part. Having religious faith is not necessarily full clarity. Faith is not something that rules out doubt, wonderment, difficulties, questions that make us think that we don't have a total kind of an answer. In saying that, this is where I want to start. Doubt is not denial, but doubt is not a denial. I'm going to suggest to you that we have to live with these deep questions which make us wonder sometimes, why is the world the way it is? Why is God acting the way God does? Cardinal John Henry Newman, great theologian of the late 1800s, once said, "1,000 difficulties do not make for one denial." And it was his way of saying, and in his life he did too, all sorts of difficulties and questions that came up about the church and the way it functioned and his role in it. But in the end of it, no matter what, he knew that this is where he belonged, and he could not deny his faith. And what I want to say, a second thing that goes along with this, when people talk at times about they have their doubts or their difficulties in being a religious believer, that is not a sign of a weak faith. I'm suggesting to you that we ought to have questions about what we believe. And I think sometimes if people don't have some deep questions about what's going on in religious belief, they're not asking the deep enough questions yet. And why would that be? We're dealing with a question of mystery in God. As one of my teachers put it one time, mystery is not what we don't know. Mystery is what we do know, but only partially, with limited insight. But we know there's something profound there, so little by little we go at it. All the astrophysicists, for example, they know they're dealing with the mystery of the universe. And it doesn't stop them. They have all sorts of questions and difficulties and problems, but they keep going because they know there's something profound to which they have to go further. They know also that they'll probably never get all the answers for what they want, but that doesn't stop them either. God is unseen. That means God is not evident. And so I think our inquiries about what goes on with God and life also is not going to be totally evident. One of my heroes in life, probably is my favorite apostle, is Thomas. And think about it. What's the name that we put in front of Thomas? The Doubting Thomas. He's always that. I like Thomas because he asked all the questions. If you remember, one time Jesus says to him, I'm going away and you do not know where I'm going and you have not asked. And Thomas says, we don't know where you're going. And how could we know? And Jesus has to tell him this. And also, after the death of Jesus, he wasn't there to see Jesus in the risen form, right? And they're telling him, Jesus is back and he's risen. This is a rather profound thing because Thomas could say, I saw the man crucified on Friday and now you're telling me he's back somehow. Oh, no. You're hallucinating or it's too much. And that's why he wanted something more to root his faith. And finally, when he saw the Lord, put your hands in my side and in my hands. And then finally, Thomas makes one of the most profound statements about the divinity of Jesus in the whole New Testament. It is, my Lord and my God. Another one that I think you know Mother Teresa, in her journals at the end of her life, she mentioned that she went through periods of time where she just wondered so much, where is God and all that? And she had such an emptiness that she wondered just about where God was in her life. Was there a God? And still she went through with this. Some people said, you see, she became an atheist at the end of her life. In actual fact, what happens a lot of times, with some of the saintly figures, they go through such a period of spiritual aridity, a dryness in life. It's happened to some of us, hasn't it? Yeah. And it's called the dark night of the soul. It's where God really purifies this person. And even without consolation and all, Mother Teresa just kept going. She just kept going with this. Not in denial, but in some challenge from the Lord to say, are you still going to stay with me through difficulty? I heard a story once, the founder of the Passionists, St. Paul of the Cross, Somebody told us one time, said he prayed for 20 years without fervor. I don't know who it was. Somebody in the back of the room said, 20 years without fervor? What fervor? And that's the kind of stuff that even we go through in this difficulty and wondering about God in our life. If Thomas the Apostle wasn't good, how about, and Mother Teresa? How about Jesus in the agony in the garden? And his prayer is, Father, take the cup of suffering away. He knew what was going to happen on Friday. I mean, it's from the beginning of his ministry, there's death threats against him. His apostles are telling him, don't go up to Jerusalem. They're going to kill you. But Jesus sees, if this is the Father's will, then not my will, but your will be done. Jesus knew what option A was Friday on the cross. He was asking, Abba, Father, do you have a plan B that we could take a look at? And yet, not my will, but your will be done. Jesus went through this same kind of a possibility of wondering, what was he going to do in the face of God's will for him? And so all of us, and I just propose that you've come across people like this, I have, who ask these hard questions about religious faith, and for some of them, it's a deal breaker and they can't go on with it. I think there's just one thing about even religious faith. There can't be a religious faith in anybody if that person doesn't have some kind of a human belief. You ask people, do you believe in yourself? Do you believe in life? These are just basic acts of faith that we all have to make at some point in life. Some people I've come across, they're in such a state of mind, they don't see any hope for life or themselves. It's pretty hard to talk about religion then until you get them into some human capacity for believing anything. What's one of the great difficulties for religious faith? It's the question of evil, isn't it? All of us have asked this at some point. Why is there so much evil in the world? Why is the world so messed up? If I were God, it's a long shot, I know. If I were God, I would have created some kind of a different world. I would have created a world where it was so good that even Democrats and Republicans would talk to one another again. I mean, it's a very hard, it's the constant ongoing question, why is there so much evil in the world? You can deal with it. Folks, it's an imperfect world. There's going to be volcanoes, there's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be monsoons, there's going to be droughts, there's going to be floods, there's all of this. People are wondering about this. Over 100 people died in Texas, in Kerrville, recently. And I can't call that an act of God. That God said, there's a bunch of girls over there in this little camp. I think I'll wipe them out this morning. I think there's an inevitability of God created a good world, but not a perfect world. And there's just going to be that constant kind of problems. But the other part, I think God created us free. And a lot of the evil of the world, I know where it comes from. I've got names and addresses and countries and places. And sometimes, people, why doesn't God do this or that? I think the question is, why doesn't so-and-so stop war? Why doesn't so-and-so stop being corrupt? Why is so-and-so so interested just in himself or herself? That kind of an attitude. So in the last account, sometimes I don't know about lots of the evil in the world, but I can probably nail it down to about 80% or so of where it comes from when you look at people who are perpetrating all the stuff that could be so different. I've dealt also with people, why doesn't God answer my prayers? I've gone through it myself. I've done things that I tell people you don't have to bargain with God. You don't have to twist God's arm. God will hear you. But I've done it. I've bargained and I've twisted and I prayed for my sister's recovery from cancer and all this kind of stuff, and it went nowhere. And so I was angry for months. And then I finally had come to a realization that God didn't kill my sister. It's all of us who want to spend so much money on armaments and cut down, as we're doing right now, on cancer research. So I wonder at times also in fundamentalism. This is a question also why people don't religiously believe anymore in some of different traditions. The Bible says such and such. The world was created in 7 days. That's it. No evolution. There's an Adam and Eve, the original parents, and they lived only about 4,060-something years ago. So some people look at this and say, well, that's not a good explanation of the world. It's in the Bible. Believe it or else. So what happens after a period of time? People just say, well, then this Bible, this religious faith is not really for me. You think sometimes of the rigidity and the rules that even you found in Catholicism and the Christian church, what we've done to people. Harshness, almost a negative attitude towards people. I keep wondering, as the German bishops have been doing for a period of time now, what is our attitude of some kind of compassion and mercy towards divorced and remarried Catholic people who've gotten into a situation where it just wasn't their foot, it broke. And all we can do is say, no, you can't come to communion. I don't find that really helpful. There's got to be some way. There's some way. And when you do that to people, you say, well, you're out. You can't come here anymore. People aren't going to bother. People who still want to be part of their church. What have we done? What kind of a face have we given to gay people? Okay, whatever your theory is about gay marriage, I mean, you just can't come at them with condemnations, and you just lose whole bunches of people. What happens when you give a face of the church which is almost anti-woman, where we do not let the feminine mystique in this thing really play its proper role? Well, I've had people just say, the church is anti-feminist, I'm not belonging, goodbye. I think sometimes of the teaching of the church on sexuality has been so one-sided and so misguided on certain kinds of things that after a while people just say, I'm not going to bother with this thing. Throw in on top of this, as people still hurt on this, the sexual abuse crisis took place not only in our church, it's taken place in 4% of all these religious leaders, whether they're Muslims, Jews, Christians, or what, 4% are some kinds of abusers. And it's been schools, private schools, Boy Scouts, and all that. But it's scandalous in the church and the cover-up of a lot of it. 5% of married men are abusers also. So I wonder with this, as it comes out, people have lots of reasons why they look at this thing and say, I don't want to belong in this thing, and whatever you're selling, it's not for me. Then on top of that, in our society, there comes after a while a practical atheism. I'm just not too interested. I'm busy. I've got other things to do. I haven't got time for it. And there's a sense of there's no personal God, the God of the Bible. Einstein, for example, believed in the possibility that there was some kind of a universal spirit, like you want to call it God, something underneath, all this. But he had no belief in any kind of a personal God, like the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Jesus. And all that stuff gets in the way of practical atheism. I do like to comment, though, about atheism of David Foster Wallace, the writer, at one point said, There is no such thing as atheism. The only choice we get is what to worship. And he said very often, what people worship is money, fame, power, control, and that becomes their kind of a god. So it is interesting as we poke around in a world that becomes more and more secular, more and more looking at what science can give as answers of evidence and proof. It makes us wonder where religious faith is in this. Second point. I want to emphasize this also, that faith is not the same as belief. It's connected. Faith is the lived experience that we have of our God in Jesus Christ and how we live that. Belief is the assent that we give to certain kinds of teachings and truths. For example, on Sundays, we have the creed, right? And that's a whole belief statement that's in there. It's the outline, it's a guideline for us. But there are things in creeds and dogmas that could be worded better or don't really get at specific issues. And there's people that tell me, I don't believe certain things in that the church teaches, a dogma or a teaching or a rule. But that's different. I ask the people, yeah, okay, you can work with that, but what does that do for your personal, subjective involvement with God in Jesus Christ? So what we're looking for in faith is not just some rational proof, some argument that says, here, you've got to believe in God or you have to accept Christianity. We won't get there. I taught theology for a long time. And at the end, I became very convinced that a lot of it was okay. Some of it made sense. Others was less than sensational. It was all prone to the possibility of being said better, being revised, getting a better insight into this. I came away with the relativity of theology. Theology is simply attempts to explain what the mystery is about. You're always going to fumble when you're trying to put this into words. So at times I don't get too excited about certain things that are supposedly a teaching, and I really don't know how to deal with this thing. One of the examples, like this, one of the teachings of the church, I'm not supposed to say this, but one of the teachings of the church, is divorced and remarried people, and they supposedly can't go to communion. Okay, that's the rule. Okay, me, I'm looking at them and saying, you want to be here? You want to go to Eucharist? You found someone else in life that you're in love with? You're still a strong believer? I would think in that situation, I mean, if somebody said, yeah, you're okay, come on back, do it again, I wouldn't point a finger at that church, at that person. And that's the kind of thing I look at that and say, I'm not sure that we've got that problem really solved. But that's a belief system. So, okay, we'll keep working at it. Over here, that doesn't do anything to shake my belief in God and Jesus Christ. What I'm saying about this thing, so some things that are taught in the church are more important than other things. Some things are subsidiary, secondary. That's why we keep focused on what is really the most important part about what our faith life is within the context of the church. And thirdly, always know where the big hand is on the watch. I'd like to leave, if possible, maybe toward the end, time for questions and answers. ask the questions and you can give the answers. The third part I want to say is when you come to faith, it involves a commitment. It involves a trust, and it becomes a very subjective also attitude that one takes on in life. You can look in beliefs and all that, and you can look at that as objectively as possible, but when you come to faith, it has to resonate with something that's deep within you. What has been proposed a lot of times in the life of faith is what the intellect can tell us about truths or teachings. I remember when I was in with the catechism, I was just told, here's the whole faith thing, got to believe the whole thing. So I took it all as one big grouping. But faith is more than just an intellectual analysis. Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher, at one time said, the failure of the 20th century was not a failure of intellect, it was not a failure of the will, it was a failure of the imagination. And the imagination, if you think of what our life is about, how we make decisions, it isn't all up here in little brain cells. We are people of emotion, passion, subjectivity, prejudice, insight, feelings, experiences. And the imagination is the faculty in us that kind of takes all of these different elements that we've come to in religion, our feeling, our emotion, how you've been treated, our passion, and you put this together with intellect, the rational part, but all the subjectivity of it, and that's what allows you finally to make a conclusion. Most of you are old enough to remember the 80s. Remember when they had those mobiles? You hung it from the ceiling, and you put little pieces on it, and if you put something too heavy on this side, it fell off, and if you left this one empty, so you had to arrange this thing with this. And once you got all of them there, it stayed, and it just hung, and you get to put all your little pieces on it. And to me, somewhat, how we've come to our life of faith through the imagination is like that mobile. We put all sorts of different pieces together. How you were raised, what your parents gave to you, what you got in schools, what your experience has been of growth, what you think about life now as an adult rather than a teenager, whether or not you sense something that this really works, and you just put pieces of your religious life together, and what the imagination does, tries to put it into a framework and says, yeah, it fits, it works. Our conclusion about the life of faith isn't simply an intellectual process. It's a web of collected issues that are going on in our life. And the imagination allows us to see if it can be integrated enough that we could believe it. And while we're doing that, as we're putting this together, it requires that you finally make a decision. The great Protestant theologian, Paul Tillich, one of his writings his books was On the Boundary. And he said it's as though we're on a boundary or on a fence that's a boundary. And here's all the world with all it's saying, it's secular kinds of concerns, and there's no room for God here or anything. And here's the religious side that says, here's life also, but it would be better if we made this religious commitment. Paul said there are some Tillich said there are some good reasons to choose this side. A lot of things in the world, money, fame, power, all that kind of stuff. Or we can go this way. But he said, finally, what you have to do, you can't live continuously on the boundary. You have to make up your mind, make a commitment, make a decision. And the other writing that he talked about this was, while you're making the decision, you need the courage to be, to exist. You have to say, I choose this, and that's why I'm a religious person. Of course, I've looked at it at times too, and sitting on a fence, you got one way or the other. If you're sitting on a picket fence, it helps you to make up your decision a whole lot quicker on this in life. But I've also come across people who are living in doubt, and they just say, I can't believe, and I won't believe until I'm so convinced, there's so many arguments that are so good that I'll get out of my doubt. So I said, well, you just live in doubt. And living in just continuously in doubt and you won't move, it's like choosing immobility as a means of transportation. You finally have to say, I have so much doubt that I'm not a believer, or I can live with this doubt, but I've made the decision and I've integrated in my life that I am. But one way or another, get off the fence. And that's even in the life of faith. We've had to keep choosing what we see in this life. It's almost a process that you go through even in continuing to believe. C.S. Lewis, the writer, at one time said, there comes a point in life where we know we have to say yes. You make a decision on this thing, and there's so much either conviction or evidence that you know that something is right. And what happens also is, I mentioned that the faith life of a 60-year-old person ought to be different than the faith life of that same person when that person was 20 years old. And it's because we grow through this, and what you have to do is continue to make the decision. This is one of the things in the life of faith, even in the face of our doubts and wonderments. It's the same thing in a married life. You get married, but if you're not continually recommitting to what the marriage is, it'll just break. You have to keep renewing what that love is into new ways. I had a friend of mine who, on her 25th wedding anniversary, she looked at her husband and said, I must have loved you very little when I married you compared to how much I love you now. And that was her way of trying to say the whole marriage, the love of this just had grown through life. And it was on a new level. I mean, it was love, but it was just a new possibility for her. And I think it's the same thing in the life of faith. We go through this and we keep making our decision. We keep making the commitment. We keep finding reasons for life to keep on going with this. By the way, the woman who said that just celebrated her 40th wedding anniversary. And to fill her bucket list on this, she, her husband, 2 of her grown kids, and it dragged along a priest, and they hiked down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And at the Grand Canyon, they renewed their marital vows and somehow had a mass down there and then somehow got back up there. Now, folks, that's commitment. Yeah. But when you wonder in the whole faith life. It's an ongoing kind of a thing. It's a subjective awareness that what you look into, what faith and the life of the church in which you are, and you finally find out, does this commitment make sense to me in my life? And when you can find something that living by your faith according to the dictates of the gospel, that makes sense to make your life fuller and better. That's why I think it's a very subjective kind of a thing that we're dealing with. The church and all can guide us. It gives us our creeds, our teachings, our theologies. It's all very helpful, but in the last analysis, this is where it functions at its best. So, my final point. I'm suggesting to you that faith and doubt can exist together simultaneously. And I think we ought to have some deep questions and wonderments because we're dealing with mystery. And I just suggest to you also that our faith life has to be rooted in important things, not just the peripheral things of what we agree with or don't agree with in life. I was just reading something about a survey of Catholics in the United States. And if you took all of the Catholics who were born or baptized Catholic or raised Catholic in the United States and put them together, they would constitute the third largest church in the United States. It would be the church, the Catholic Church of the non-Catholics. And when I see a statistic like that, it makes me wonder, what didn't these people find? Or what did we do to drive them out? Or where were we not clear enough or loving enough to say, yes, this is your home? And it's interesting, in this survey I was just reading, they asked people, holistic questions about Catholicism. And the top point of interest, these 70% of the people, these Catholic people, said the most important thing was faith in God and Jesus Christ. It's really interesting. You think, and down the list came other kinds of things, it fosters the spirit of love in me, or the teachings of the Pope help me, or the sacramental Eucharist. Belonging to the Eucharist is a big thing. What surprised me also is what 40% or so of these people who were asked, what was really important to them, and was devotion to the Blessed Mother. It's sort of something that just stayed. It was in there with their upbringing or something, and it's also, I think, the feminine dimension of what Catholicism can be also. There's an old saying, ecclesia semper reformanda est. The church always has to be renewed. They're going to come up with different kinds of insights or ways of talking about things, maybe change some things, give better insights. That's all good. But that's the church. I suggest also we have to encourage the inner life of faith, which is given to us through the life of grace, but intensity of prayer life, reading of Scripture, holding on faithful, and saying, Lord, to whom else shall we go? We have come to believe that you have the words of eternal life. So I'm suggesting to you that our religious faith, it's not more demonstrable, it's not more provable than love. It's not more unreasonable than love. I used to ask my students sometimes, they were looking, do you got a proof, I should believe? And I would say, you got a boyfriend? Yeah. Does your boyfriend love you? Yeah. I said, prove it. I said, Well, you know, I know he, I said, prove it. You want me to prove? You prove it, he loves you. He brought me flowers for my birthday. I said, he's having an affair on the side, he's just covering up his tracks, okay? What do you got? And then one said, he brought me chocolate. And I said, it's probably dark chocolate because he hates it. He wants milk chocolate and all that. I said, prove it to me. And then, you know, they get kind of uppity with me. And finally said, I know he loves me. I know it. And that also, folks, is a way of knowing. That's what I'm suggesting. It's not just an intellectual head trip. It's the integrative fact of what we put together in life and saying, I can't prove that so-and-so loves so-and-so, but they know it. And that's why I think even in people sometimes with faith, they say, I know that I know. I just know that I know. And it's something here. It's personal, it's subjective, it makes sense to me. I can say, you know, I think the Catholic tradition especially has tried to maintain most strongly the intellectual tradition that goes together with faith. The Catholic tradition has really been strong on faith and reason, this world and the other world, intellect, will, emotion. It puts things together. It's an integrative faction. Lutherans have been strong on this too, so have the Anglicans been strong on this. And when we look at faith, we're looking at the scientists and we're trying to say, can faith live in a world that is in evolution? A couple of years ago, I was reading one book by John Hort, who it was Faith After Darwin, and the whole thing, he put it into the context of Darwin and evolution, can you do it? And then there was another one he put, Faith After Freud, and that was another one, you know. And then there was one, it was, well, this was by John Holt, and it was Faith and Physics. I only got about halfway through that one. It was pretty rugged, and we're trying to do this. We want to listen to the scientists. We want to be reasonable in our faith. It's not just some little interior warm feeling that I have. We can talk boldly about the reasonableness of what our faith is, but also it is something that becomes interior with us. Langdon Gilkey, who taught for years up at Chicago, he said, you know, when I first started teaching, he said, I just thought the answers to life were either in psychology or in economics. You know, it was about either money or something. He could explain everything. And every time he tried to really get at the basis of what people were searching for in life, he said, inevitably, I started falling back into philosophical and theological language. And I didn't think I'd get there. And little by little, he started to say, I think some of the answers that I had, that the secular world was showing me, were good answers. But they weren't quite deep enough because they left out this important integrating part of what a person believes deeply in the center of themselves, not just in peripheral kinds of things. So a question I could almost ask anybody. I had a friend of mine, a woman who was a Jew, and she was very fervent about her religious faith and also her ethnicity, her Judaism. And she said to me one time, if I ever ceased to be a Jew, I think physically or religiously, she said, I think it would do violence to me because I no longer would know who I am and what I'm about. And that's an interesting question you could almost ask. If you ever gave up your religious faith, you know, would it make a difference? How much of a difference would it make? I see some people who have done this and they just seem to be fine, and I wonder how deep the religious conviction was. Was it just, you showed up once in a while, Christmas and Easter, and said a couple of prayers, kind of a cultural Christianity? Because I have a feeling that if somehow I was made to no longer believe in God and Jesus and what I think life in the world is about, I think it would hurt me. I'd have to really think through that kind of a thing. Maybe it's just because I know, the church and faith, it's my home, it's where I belong, and I'm happy there. But I think if you had to give up your religious faith, it should do some kind of violence to you. It should change you, that you'd say, I've got to find a whole other way to come at life. So I think in talking about religious faith, I think it's a way of trying for us to make sense out of a world and our life, trying to see reality in life in a coherent, intelligible way. I think it can give us a framework by which we live. Sometimes one person asked me, give me a short framework, give me something I can just deal with that'll be a guideline for me. And I said, okay, well, 3 short chapters, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. It's the Sermon on the Mount. And it's Jesus' whole ethical teaching. And I say, try that one and see how it goes. It gives us this moral vision. It helps us to live life even when the difficulties of life hit us. It's what our faith is about. I'll give you time. I'll just give you one little story that I like. Archbishop Weakland was in Milwaukee at one point. He was a wonderful man. And some young guys came to him, kind of, come on, Archbishop, talk to us. Give us reasons why we should be Catholics. Why do we still hang in there? Why should we bother at all? Come on, I want to argue with you. And Weakland knew that this was going to go nowhere. It was just, nah. So Weakland finally said to me, I will do that with you. I'll do that. But he said, first of all, there were 2 conditions that you have to fulfill. You want to talk about Catholicism. He said, 1, for the next 6 months, I want you to go to Mass every Sunday, and I want you to pray intently at Mass. And I want you to know what you're doing when you're receiving Holy Communion. And you put yourself into it and really let it work on you, okay? And he said, the second thing, for the next 6 months, I want you to volunteer in a soup kitchen, or I want you to go work with the homeless, or I want you to go to a retirement home and work with the elderly or people who need somebody to push their wheelchair. I want you to go out there maybe and give gloves and hats to the people who are homeless and need some. I want you to do that pretty intently for 6 months. Mass, work with the poor. He said, then come back to me, and then we'll talk about Catholicism. They never came back. And I think what Weakland was trying to do to them is say, you just want to bicker with me about little parts. You don't like this, you don't like that. What about that? That should be changed. That ain't it. You want to focus on it. He said, come back to me after those 6 months. You'll be a different person. Then we can talk. And speaking of talking, I said I was going to leave some time for questions about this. So now is the time. Now is the time. Now is the time. I have either mesmerized you or I have killed you. And if it's the latter, I'm going to go around and search for body parts that we can do. Anyhow, it's want you to get home before it's dark. And one thing that I learned over the years about dealing with a group like this, the mind can only absorb what the fanny can endure. So it's time to go home, folks. Thank you for coming, and maybe we'll see you next week. Okay, guys. Okay.